Luke Vargas is the United Nations Bureau Chief for Talk Radio News Service. He's joined us from all over the world, and today he is in Bolivia, the site of the People's World Conference on Climate Change and the Defense of Life, which is a summit hosted by the president, Evo Morales. Ban Ki-moon was there. We also had appearances from the presidents of Venezuela and Ecuador. Really a cast of characters of important political figures from different areas. This is the second time that this conference has been held. People may not be familiar with the conference, Luke, so let's start there.
Sure. It seems like an unlikely place to hold a meeting of this type. This town, Tiquipaya, which is on the outskirts of Cochabamba, is a very small, quiet community. The reason it's being held here is not because of any special environmental significance of this place. It's because it's the political headquarters of President Morales. So it's more of out of political and organizational expediency. The real intellectual impetus for holding this conference goes back to 2009. There were climate talks in Copenhagen that were deemed by most activists to be an utter failure for two main reasons. One, China and the United States essentially hijacked the negotiating process of that treaty. They negotiated in a back room and sort of scrapped years of negotiations up until that point. And the other reason was that there was a goal in Copenhagen of mimicking sort of a binding commitment akin to Kyoto. And instead, what we saw was a more non-binding sort of accord. And what began to happen was that targets were done away with, the individual commitments of countries, and in their place, we started looking at outcomes. It's when we started shifting the conversation from what should each country do, what should they ought to do, to what's the maximum level of temperature increase that the world can stomach to avoid the adverse effects of climate change. So it's sort of that marginalization in a political sense, and also the depressing realization that climate targets were just getting weaker and weaker that prompted the government in 2010 to hold the first Tiquipaya climate change conference here.
And so we had that first conference in 2010. What were the sort of specific policies advocated there? How now, 5 years later, can we evaluate where we are in comparison to or in relation to what was discussed then? And then what specifically came of this year's talks?
Well, it's depressing. If you talk to the organizers of this conference, their assessment is that in the 5 years since, things have pretty much gotten worse. I can sort of back that up. I'll take three main points. The first is the argument that rich countries shouldn't negotiate on behalf of developing countries. That's improved a little bit. Algeria is one of two countries helping to craft the Paris Climate Treaty. The United States is the other one, and I guess it's better that the U.S. has been involved in this from the very start instead of coming in at the last minute and throwing things into chaos. So the developing countries essentially do have a voice. Though I'll point out again that Laurent Fabius, the French foreign minister who's chairing the Paris climate talks, has also said on many occasions that the treaty needs to be non-binding in certain areas so that the U.S. Senate doesn't need to approve a treaty. So in that regard, the developing world is still setting the agenda. The other two areas are about sort of the fixes that you might put in place to mitigate climate change. Bolivia is very much upset by the notion that after Copenhagen, when it didn't look like the world was going to be able to stop climate change, that these so-called false solutions started being talked about. Geoengineering, GMOs, biofuels, nanotechnology to re-engineer rivers and remove pollution from the air and from the water. This is viewed as sort of a betrayal of the protection of the planet by here in Bolivia. And unfortunately, as we look towards Paris, we see a huge corporate interest there. Many countries realize this is a chance for us to make money off of this, as opposed to, what are the best solutions for the planet. And third is what we call technology transfer, in favor of this notion that rich countries should help or entirely subsidize the cost of adapting low carbon technologies in the developing world. They don't want there to be patents in place for the technologies that save the environment. They want locally run businesses in each country to have a chance to implement these measures. And again, as we look towards Paris, I think the conclusion that many people have here is that there's just way too much corporate influence on this, and they've taken over where political leaders have failed.
Well, in thinking of capitalism and corporate influence and some of the players that were there, starting with, of course, President Evo Morales, the idea of the anti-capitalist summit would lead some to question whether there are some climate technologies that maybe are viable technologies, but are being tossed aside more as a result of what they represent within that idea of capitalism. Is that happening?
it's I think it is happening to a degree, and as an American, I'm very used to the way political rhetoric works in the U.S. When you have a summit and its title is the anti-capitalist gathering, where capitalism is described by President Morales as the cancer to Mother Earth, it's easy to start reading some suspicion into each of the things that are said. With regards to certain renewable energies, I certainly think the skepticism of technology has led Bolivia to not be as diverse as terms of its energy sources. There's a big poster going around here that says the Bolivian government should have 20% solar energy by 2020. Currently, even though they have very high solar irradiation here, there's hardly any solar power compared to neighboring countries that have really taken this on. So there is some skepticism there. Nanotechnology, again, I looked at the sort of the end document from the 2010 conference, and it said, we need to reject nanotechnology. And I talked to the organizer of that conference yesterday, the former UN ambassador, and said, sounds like you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. Nanotechnology helps the world. It gives you the iPhone that you're holding now. And he said, oh, well, we only meant nanotechnology insofar as geoengineering projects, which are a false promise. And I said, look, words matter here, and you need to be very careful about not making the world think that you're just rejecting progress in pursuit of what are some noble goals. So again, it speaks to sort of maybe one of the difficulties of this conference, which is that it's being chaired by a very ideological government. Evo Morales is quite a bombastic politician, to say the very least. And again, I think some of his statements turn off much greater swaths of the world than are actually turned on by his message at times.
In thinking of people in glass houses throwing stones, or the pot calling the kettle black, or whatever, a proverb, analogy, whatever you want to use. During the UN climate talks in Poland, we talked with you about how the Polish government has heavy reliance on coal, and that sort of overshadowed the event, and it caused some credibility questions. The Bolivian government, are they living up to the rhetoric that they are pushing vis-a-vis this conference?
The issue of deforestation is one where a lot of critics say they're not. There's actually this little comic going around that shows Evo Morales holding a chainsaw and cutting down the forests. Now, Bolivia has very low carbon emissions per capita when you do not factor in deforestation. When you begin to put that into the picture and you talk about 300,000 hectares or more being deforested a year, and in particularly damaging ways, including burning down the forests, this becomes a big issue. Now, Evo Morales lectures regularly on the fact that Bolivians have more trees per capita than the United States or Western Europe. That's really only half of the picture here. And this is a particularly problematic issue here in Bolivia because of the very unique way that climate change is affecting this country. In areas where deforestation is occurring, climate change is actually increasing the temperatures and causing there to be more precipitation. And the problem with deforestation is it removes the stable soil base, and it increases flooding. It increases basically the risks of extra rain. In the big cities where water is in high demand, we're seeing climate change bring the temperatures, make them colder. It's more arid. And so those are the areas where there's water scarcity being encountered, and it's worsening that area. So again, when you talk about what Bolivia needs to do, it really, you would think, needs to be working more on cutting down deforestation. And this is such a big issue here that this poster I referenced earlier is from an alternate conference that was being held here this week. You'd think that all the issues would fit under the umbrella of this People's Conference. Not so. There was sort of a counter summit where they're saying Evo Morales needs to focus on ending deforestation. Again, very interesting that even a summit like this doesn't include every political persuasion.
Last thing in the very limited time we have left, any bullet point specific appeals or ideas that cut through the clutter at the conference?
Yeah, it was sort of a hodgepodge of everything from anti-oil protests to, here, take a photo with a bust of Hugo Chavez, DVD vendors selling footage of the U.S. invasion of Panama. So again, a whole mess of issues. There were some things that were powerful. The Bolivian government wants there to be a international rights of Mother Earth that is recognized. It's a very meaningful sort of, I can understand the emotions behind that. They want an international climate tribunal to hold countries accountable to their pledges. And finally, in light of all the refugee situations we've been encountering in Europe, and we know this is going to be an issue with climate change, the government here so sensitive to indigenous populations, which truly are adversely affected by climate change and so marginalized in the political process. They want there to be a change in international law that recognizes climate refugees, and they want developed countries to take over basically the responsibility of helping to resettle these people. So, the music was beautiful. Some of the politics got me lost, but again, there are some really overarching resonant issues here that I hope do carry over to some extent to Paris in December.
All right, Luke Vargas, Talk Radio News Service, joining us today from Bolivia. Luke, thank you as always.